In the years leading up to World War II, the British Royal Navy recognised naval aviation as both an opportunity and a threat. To keep their fleet safe from attack by enemy air power, they needed fast, agile and advanced naval fighters. What they ended up with turned out to be none of those things. It was this, the Fairey Fulmar. Throughout history, some machines are regarded as great. Their pioneering innovation, groundbreaking performance, market-leading success or battlefield glory have made them legends, and they have gone on to be enshrined in the history books. This is not their story. These, instead, are the stories of the forgotten many. The failed designs, sales flops, and occasional unsung heroes that have become the yardstick against which the legends are compared. Yet they deserve to be so much more than that, for in their own unique way, they are parts of history. The story of the Fairey Fulmar begins in 1936, with an aircraft that was neither a fighter nor built for the Navy. That aircraft, the Fairey P4/34, was a development of the battle light bomber, and was intended to fulfill the Royal Air Force's needs for a light dive bomber and attack plane. Although the P4/34 was not chosen for the RAF, as the Hawker Henley was deemed more suitable, it received interest from the Royal Danish Navy, which planned to put a license-built version of the P4/34 into service. However, Denmark was invaded by the Germans before production could begin. The Danish weren't the only navy interested in the design, however. In 1938, the British Royal Navy issued Operational Requirement 08/38, calling for a two-man fleet defence fighter capable of performing long-range patrols. To fulfill the requirement, Fairey decided to use the P4/34 as its starting point and modify the design to work on aircraft carriers. This was the result, the Fairey Fulmar. It was essentially a navalised version of the P4/34, featuring folding wings and arrestor gear to allow for carrier operations. Compared to the P4/34 it was based on, and for that matter the Fairey battle bomber that spawned the P4/34, the airframe was slightly smaller and had improved aerodynamics. As with those designs, pilot and navigator were seated in tandem, and power came from a single 1080 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which could get the Fulmar up to 230 miles an hour. And that rather marginal power and top speed, combined with the added weight of naval modifications, turned out to be one of the Fulmar's biggest problems. Because when the first prototype took to the air on January 4th, 1940, it was immediately apparent that the Fulmar would be outrun by almost every other fighter aircraft of the time. The prototype was refitted with the more powerful Mark 8 variant of the Merlin, which increased the speed of the aircraft to 265 miles an hour. This was still not blazingly fast by the standards of the time, but it was considered adequate for the Royal Navy, which desperately needed modern fighters to replace the outdated planes serving with the Fleet Air Arm, many of which were still open cockpit biplanes. The Fulmar entered service with 806 Squadron Fleet Air Arm in July 1940, and initially served off the carrier HMS Illustrious. The new plane came as a surprise to both old Fleet Air Arm pilots transferring off biplanes, who found themselves overwhelmed with its much higher top speed, and newly trained pilots coming off land-based trainers, who were severely underwhelmed by the slow lumbering fighter. By September that year, the Fulmars began operating in the Mediterranean theatre, protecting convoys from Italian bombers. Initially, despite its shortcomings, the Fulmar was quite effective. By using its superb endurance, it could wait at high altitudes as the carrier's radar spotted incoming planes, then make diving attacks using the speed boost from gravity to catch up and close the gap. Once in gun range, the lightly built Italian bombers were usually easy prey for the Fulmar's 8 Brownings. This strategy fell apart, however, when the Luftwaffe entered the fray. The heavy Fulmar was slower even than a Heinkel 111 medium bomber, and due to its poor handling compared to land-based fighters and lack of a rear-mounted gun, it was particularly vulnerable to attack from behind. Some Fulmar navigators took to carrying Tommy guns to provide some measure of protection, and others resorted to firing their flare pistols at the incoming planes, or if all else failed, literally throwing whatever they could lay their hands on at the enemy behind. Another issue was that German bombers, unlike their Italian counterparts, were made with metal skins, which were better at withstanding the relatively small caliber Browning machine guns used on most British fighters at the time, including the Fulmar. Nevertheless, the Fulmar stayed in service, and was even able to get some successes. It performed well as an escort plane in the Battle of Taranto on the 11th of November 1940, helping the Swordfish bombers inflict severe damage on the Italian battleship fleet, and once again proved effective at the Battle of Cape Matapan, where a Fulmar was able to shoot down one of the two Junkers 88s escorting the Italian fleet. In May 1941, the Fulmar's long range proved useful, this time in the Atlantic, when it was used to spot and track the German battleship Bismarck. It was around this time that the Mark I Fulmar was being superseded by the Mark II version, developed in January 1941 and using a more powerful Mark 30 Merlin engine to give a top speed of 272 miles an hour, about 7 miles an hour faster than the Mark I. Still, every little bit helped. Some of the old Mark Is were assigned to the CAM program, that is, the Catapult Armed Merchantman. Basically, they'd be fired off a track on the deck of a cargo ship to provide air cover when convoys, which at the time didn't have carriers sailing with them due to wartime shortages, were in danger of attack from Germany's long-range Focke-Wulf 200 bombers. The CAM program was a somewhat successful deterrent measure, although the Fulmars never saw combat in this role, as faster Sea Hurricanes made up all 9 of the combat sorties launched. That said, Fulmars serving off carriers did participate in convoys to Soviet Russia, where they also formed part of the ill-fated Operation EF, an air raid on the enemy ports of Kirkenes and Petsamo in July 1941, that resulted in the loss of several aircraft after the raid was spotted by German reconnaissance. The Fleet Air Arms War changed again in early 1942, when, following the Japanese invasion of British Pacific territories and the sinking of HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales by Japanese aircraft, several squadrons of Fulmars were deployed across the Pacific theatre to provide the fighter protection that the British were severely lacking in the Far East. Unfortunately, service in the Pacific theatre made the type's shortcomings even more apparent. Japan's best carrier fighter, the A6M-0, was one of the fastest and most manoeuvrable fighters of early World War II, and against it and other modern Japanese aircraft, the sluggish Fulmar really had very little chance. Despite the odds though, the Fulmar was forced to hold the line until it was superseded by navalised versions of the Hurricane and Spitfire, and American aircraft such as the Grumman Martlet and Vought Corsair throughout 1942. The Fulmar's finest hour came when it was assigned to low-level protection of convoys headed to Malta between 1941 and 42. In the Fulmar's final major operation, Operation Pedestal, 16 Mark II Fulmars flying from HMS Victorious worked alongside Sea Hurricanes, Martlets and Spitfires to defend a convoy carrying fuel and essential supplies to the port of Valletta from enemy aircraft. Despite heavy losses, including the sinking of the carrier HMS Eagle and 9 of the 14 merchant ships in the convoy, the fighter cover helped the operation achieve its goal of delivering supplies to Malta, thus relieving the pressure on the island and saving it from surrender. After Pedestal, the Fulmar continued in service as a reconnaissance plane and trainer. It was also used as a night fighter, equipped with radar, but the added weight and drag from the aerials and equipment blunted its already woeful performance so severely that only 100 of the 600 Fulmars built were ever converted as such. By March 1943, Fairey finally had a replacement for the Fulmar ready for service. The Firefly, which was essentially the ultimate development of the Fulmar design, had further improved aerodynamics and a Rolls-Royce Griffon engine that finally gave the Royal Navy a fast, long-range two-person fleet defence fighter. Still, despite being obsolete from the moment it left the drawing board, the Fulmar does have one major achievement to its name. By the end of World War II, the type was credited with 122 kills, and only 40 Fulmars were lost to enemy fire, with only 16 of those being shot down by other aircraft. Those 122 kills made the outclassed, outperformed Fulmar the highest scoring aircraft type in the Fleet Air Arm during World War II. But let's be honest, despite that accolade, the Fulmar really wasn't much of a fighter. Most contemporary historians agree that the Royal Navy used the advantage of radar to provide early warning, and developed tactics that would use the Fulmar's range and firepower to compensate for the fact that it couldn't go very fast or turn very tightly. So why then did Fairey develop this aircraft to have almost none of the traits generally favoured by fighter planes? And why did the Admiralty insist on such a bizarre and mediocre fighter becoming the backbone of their fleet defence in early World War II? To answer those questions, let's have a look at the naval situation of the time. See, aircraft carriers didn't really exist until after World War I was over, and the use of aircraft in warfare overall was still in its infancy. During the interwar period, there were a lot of military commanders with ideas on how to use aircraft, and very little combat for them to prove their strategies. What most commanders agreed on, however, is that aircraft made excellent reconnaissance and spotter planes, and that the use of fighters was critical to ensure that the enemy's spotters couldn't spy on you. Another takeaway from World War I, particularly by the British Admiralty, was the superiority of the battleship. After all, hadn't the super dreadnoughts of the Royal Navy repelled the Kaiser's fleet at Jutland? And weren't other European navies building fleets of capital ships to rival Britain's? Considering that, and combining it with the fact that aircraft were proven in reconnaissance, the use of aircraft to patrol, spot and track enemy warships, thus allowing the long-range guns of the Royal Navy's battlecruisers to shoot first, made a lot of sense to the Admiralty. But wait a sec, what's any of that got to do with the Fulmar being a fleet defence fighter? Yes, it had a long range and a navigator, which made it an effective spotter, but 08/38 called for it to be a fighter first and foremost. But before we look at why Fairey turned a dive bomber into a fighter plane, let's consider those other two words in the Fulmar's job title, fleet defence, and ask ourselves what the Fulmar might be expected to defend a fleet against. Probably not carrier-based planes, considering the way navies were going in 1930s Europe. The Soviets, who had recently signed the non-aggression pact with Germany and were making hostile moves towards Poland, had no aircraft carriers and only had seaplanes on their larger vessels. The Italian Navy was in a similar situation, with seaplanes being launched by catapult from battleships and cruisers. And, even though the German Kriegsmarine had a carrier under construction, it wasn't expected to be completed until the mid to late 1940s, by which time a replacement for the Fulmar would likely be ready. Besides that, the Fulmar was expected to patrol over the open sea, not within range of land-based fighters or attack planes. That meant the Fulmar wasn't expected to face aircraft like this, but rather aircraft like this. Against spotter seaplanes and flying boats, the Fulmar's dive bomber heritage didn't really matter so much, as it had superior speed and handling simply down to being an aerodynamically cleaner and more powerful aircraft. And as speed and manoeuvrability were less of an issue for the Fulmar than they were for its land-based cousins like the Spitfire and Hurricane, the designers focused on giving it long range and a second crewman for more effective reconnaissance and long overwater patrols. That, in turn, meant the Fairey P4/34, with its focus on a high payload and space for a second crew member, could easily be adapted from a high-speed dive bomber to a fighter that, while not so fast, was definitely good enough to fulfill the Admiralty's requirements. But while the Fulmar might have sounded good in principle, in practice it was almost never used to defend battle fleets against catapult-launched seaplanes or flying boats. In the European theatre of World War II, fleet defence turned out to mean escorting convoys through a gauntlet of land-based torpedo planes and bombers, either in the Mediterranean or past Norway, and in the Pacific, the Fulmar was put up against the Japanese Zero, an aircraft which was designed from the outset to be a light, nimble carrier fighter, and whose performance was equal to or better than most land-based fighters of the time. Against those odds, the Fulmar wasn't a brilliant option, but it was the best of many bad options available to the fleet air arm at the start of World War II. And when its long endurance was coupled with the use of shipboard radar, some of its shortcomings were negated, at least in part. However, once the Admiralty got better aircraft, and relaxed their insistence on having 2 crew aboard fighters, the Fulmar, despite its surprisingly good combat record, was finally declared obsolete by its own navy and replaced with designs that had learned the lessons from this unusual plane. So, in conclusion, let's take another look at the Fairey Fulmar. It was an aircraft full of contradictions and confusion. A dive bomber turned fighting reconnaissance plane that was forced by the circumstances of World War II to become a frontline fighter against far better opponents. An aircraft designed for long range and stable flight, yet derided for favouring those attributes over speed and agility. And yet, despite its many flaws, the Fulmar was an aircraft that managed to hold its own and even succeed, long enough for the fleet air arm to turn the tide, and long enough for Fairey to learn the lessons from the design and get its successor into production. So, while the Fulmar was hardly a world beater, it was still good enough to see the Royal Navy through one of the toughest periods of World War II, and despite the shortcomings due to misguided naval strategy and downright odd design specifications, it managed to work successfully with new tactics and become the highest scoring British naval fighter of World War II. Sure, it might not be as famous as other naval fighters, and it might have been mocked and criticised for its obsolete design and poor deployment, but the Fairey Fulmar certainly is an important part of history.